I call this meeting to order for the TIF workshop for the Bethany City Council.
Good evening, council members and staff. This is a follow-up to our first official public hearing that we had last week. Unlike last week, this is not going to be a formal presentation. We kind of wanted it, obviously you guys aren't up on the dais. We wanted it to be more of a conversational kind of workshop to where we answer your questions directly and try to get at some of the concerns that you guys might have about both of these project plans and about TIF in general. If I could introduce Leslie Batchelor, she's the president of our firm and my boss. She's a TIF and public-private partnerships generally guru, specializes in this and has been doing this for 20 years almost. So
almost. Scary.
Yeah.
And so thanks for having us tonight. I feel a little awkward about this seating. Do I need to use the mic?
Probably.
Should I use
You can use the handheld
this
if you
one?
want, sure.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let Jeff do most of the talking, so this won't take long. But I just wanted to start off with like kind of three broad themes about TIF, and then hand it off to Jeff for particulars, and I'd be glad to answer any questions along the way. But I've learned the hard way through this almost 20 years of experience that anytime you're talking about something that's as technical as TIF, there can be a lot of misconceptions, and there's a lot of information in these project plans, and there's this weird sense that, well, we should understand this because it has to do with like some familiar things, taxes, and you're making policies. But there are three really common misconceptions about TIF that I think if we keep those in our heads, then as we get into the details, it's easier to think strategically about how best to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish. And so one reason I think it's easy to get off track sometimes is that, frankly, TIF is a really flexible tool, which is what's so great about it. But the flip side of that is that there's no one size fits all. There's no single answer. So you hear people say things like, well, in a TIF, the developer always gets 50% of the taxes he generates. Well, because that's what one project did. And so sometimes people think there are these really hard and fast specific rules about how deals get done. So if you just keep in mind that it's a flexible tool like your other city spending, and of course, like your other city spending, it has rules attached to it. But the point is to bring about the objectives that the city has established for itself. And you all have had some really good planning processes, so you're in a good position to do this. So those three quick things are, no matter how many times I say this, I don't say it often enough, TIFs do not raise anyone's taxes. They do not change the tax rate. They do not change the levy. When we talk about new tax revenues, what we're talking about is that growth in investment and the taxes that are paid on the new investment at the same rate, whether it's sales or ad valorem taxes that you paid before. So number one, TIFs do not raise taxes. Number two, TIFs are neither endless nor are they are a bargain really as between a term of years and a budget. And the city has struck that bargain with the other taxing jurisdictions, the ad valorem property tax jurisdictions that were represented on the review committee. And basically the deal is, will you give us 25 years or the amount of time short of that it takes to generate enough revenues to fund these projects to do what we've set out to do? So it's an either or. Like if you don't get it done in 25 years, it will end regardless. On the other hand, if you meet your budget targets, which we've set in a really aspirational, optimistic way, if you happen to meet those sooner, then once that's collected and paid off, the TIF is done, even if it happened in 19 years instead of 25.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Absolutely.
Once the TIF is paid, then those entities that participated in that, then the total amount of those taxes are going to those entities.
That's exactly right. So of course, once the TIF has collected its total amount or has hit that term of years, then all the revenues flow to those taxing jurisdictions just like they did before. But in the interim, they're going to just get that base. And and we, the city, will collect the part above. And so what they're looking forward to is, can you generate this growth and put us in a position that will have more revenue at the end of the day than if we had sat around doing nothing, and nobody would be better off, not the schools, not the county, and not the city. So secondly, they've got this bargain, which leads to the third point. If you sit around and do nothing, your TIF will do nothing. It is an empty bucket. It is a promise that you will have some things you can do, and it can be an enticement to developers, but it still takes hustle. I mean, cities have to be out there, in the same kind of business of pointing out development opportunities, talking to prospective developers about what you want to see done. This is publicly driven. If someone shows up with a crummy project, I hope you will say no to them, because it's not worth it. That project will be here, and it sure doesn't deserve extra help. So, but when there's something that your community wants and needs, an attractive, high-quality project, then the TIF gives you a way to invest in it and say, we want better rather than just ordinary. Whatever happens to show up. One of my themes is that, we as Oklahomans are taught to be grateful for whatever we get. And, in life, that's a pretty good attitude, attitude of gratitude. But in development, it's not. When we settle for less, we get less. The communities that ask for more, that set high standards for their signage and the appearance of things and the quality of building, they end up looking better. There is a market reality, but the TIF helps you improve that market reality. It's not a cure-all, but it does help push you a little bit the right direction. So those three things. TIFs do not raise taxes. It ends either at the period of years or when you collect your budget, and it doesn't happen by itself. So I make the easy points, I make him do the hard part. So.
Well, my part's almost already been stated at the last meeting. My mic is turned up way high, which is good because you guys can actually hear me. So Leslie pointed out that with TIF, you go and you actively recruit developers, and you work with developers and property owners to make things happen. And that doesn't necessarily happen to be the only thing that you can do to make development happen. Sometimes it's as simple as, we need some new infrastructure put in, and there's really no other way that the city can use its CIP funds. Might already be encumbered in some other project, but this is a good way to allow the development to pay for the infrastructure it needs. And that's why there is this public improvements and infrastructure budget category in both project plans. But even more? Okay. How's that? Okay. But the bulk of the work that the TIF will help actually get built comes through assistance and development financing. And this is where you're working with on real estate projects with a developer who either has a project that won't happen for some financial reason, or you're pushing for something higher and better than what the market would produce otherwise. So this is the 39th Street budget, and I hope you guys either remember this or have a copy of it in front of you. This is just from the presentation from last week. You'll notice that the budget categories are overwhelmingly in favor of that assistance and development financing compared to the public infrastructure improvement category. That being said, these are still caps, so when you work through whatever plans or policies you put in place to make development happen, you have to make sure it fits within the ultimate budget. And these are the budget numbers that Leslie was talking about, that if you meet these numbers, they get cut off, or the TIF cuts off early. Does anybody have any questions about just generally how it works, or about the 39th Street budget? We want this to be an interactive conversation, not just us talking to you guys. So,
I have a question. This is like the total TIF amount. So if someone comes in, let's say on 23rd Street, and they're only going to do a small piece of that, does it come out like on pro rata on the way it's split out there? Like that 18.5 is a certain percentage of the whole amount. Does that same ratio go towards a piece of that TIF?
No, each one will be individually, you can decide, like, this is a project that needs infrastructure, or this is a project where I just need to help the developer directly over time. But it will proportionately, on sort of a pro rata basis, be what's paying into the TIF. You know, like if it generates a new $500,000 in value, then that little fraction of it in taxes each year goes towards ultimately generating the full budget amount. So I guess the simple answer is no, you're not constrained by that division on
So
individual
you can
projects.
vary that on.
Exactly.
These are just the budget caps. So if you can go through your entire public improvements budget in one project if you decided that was worth it. But then you wouldn't have any more of that budget category to work with, and you'd have to work through the rest of your projects through one of these other budget categories. And I mean, it's some additional administrative work to keep track of where your expenditures are going, but it's required by the statute each year for any TIF district. You have to submit an annual report or prepare an annual report, publish it, and submit it to all the taxing jurisdictions. And that report shows how much increment you've actually collected in a year and how much you've spent and in which budget category you've spent that money on. So the taxing jurisdictions know what the TIF's progress is and how much time they may have left. It's part of the bargain. Sir?
Reiterate, if you will, where do these numbers come from? Where did we get these based on?
These numbers are based on, if you go, so we went through me and Hank went through a lot of the parcels using 23rd Street as an example. We went through all of the parcels along this 23rd Street corridor and figured out which parcels were good candidates for redevelopment or reinvestment. And we highlighted those parcels in the county assessor's website. You can go and you can search parcels by individual tax parcel number. Figured out how much value is currently there, figuring out what's on it, what state it's in. We looked at the age of the buildings that are on it, general state of repair, whether something's there at all, whether there's additional development that can be built on that site, and figured out, it was essentially estimated what we thought the highest and best use was on that site and what the value of that highest and best use was, and compared that to what's there right now. Comparing it to what's there right now is essentially that base assessed value, the number that's the increment is generated when the value increases above that. So for each of these sites collectively, those budget amounts come from the overall anticipated, or what we think is what the market would support in new development within these entire yellow areas above what's currently there.
Fair to say there is some subjectivity attached to that.
Yes, and so that there's quite a bit of subjectivity, but it's also based on our firm's collective experience and Hank's experience in development. Leslie can chime in a little bit about how.
I'm not sure I would use the term subjectivity. There's a fair amount of analysis that goes into it, and there are some assumptions that need to be made. Things like, even assuming that an undeveloped parcel can and will be redeveloped or developed, you have the question of when that will happen, and obviously no one knows. So what we try to do is make reasonable estimates that it's not all going to happen tomorrow, but a few things will happen each year. So the projections are actually taking some of the parcels happening this year, some the year after that, and then running the numbers at the tax levies. So you can see how it comes out mathematically. It's not like we just say, well, we want it to be 44 million or whatever. It's really a pretty careful analysis, but it is, none of us have a crystal ball. But the thing that's important about this versus an authorization for a debt is that this is just a hoped for number. You are not committing yourselves to spending this money. It's just saying, okay, we promise we won't go higher than this. So we want you to have enough room that if you make some projects happen, you will reap the rewards of that with that incremental revenue that comes off it. So it is pretty carefully done, but there are definitely assumptions, and what you can do is go into the spreadsheet and say, oh, it's not going to happen this fast. It's going to happen much more slowly, and so, it should be lower, But we've had those conversations with staff, and it seems like arming you with the kind of the largest tool we can here is
And-
kind of the marching orders we've got at this point.
And with 23rd Street in particular, and with the TIF-C and the 39th Street, the ones that are more on a wider area and consist of several non-contiguous parcels, we looked at a lot of new comps around of things that would be supported by the zoning district that's underlying those particular parcels to use as a basis for what we thought the new development would potentially generate. And then in terms of timing, we just kind of assumed that it would, over a period of maybe 15 to 20 years, ramp up. So we don't assume that it's all going to be there on day one. We assume that it's going to ramp up incrementally as Hank and others in the city can actually make these projects happen.
So you're budgeting for this TIF district $28 million, and that's gonna be collected as from the start of the TIF district to 25 years from now. You're hoping that the property taxes and all that will make up that $28 million?
Yes.
Now, are you gonna be able to loan that total price out as soon as it starts? Or are you gonna be able to loan, are you able to do the infrastructure or, economic incentives as you collect it?
But part of it is that nothing is going to be a definite start date, and nothing is a definite end date. We just have this window of opportunity. This is what we're estimating, but we're estimating also on the difference. So I'm going to use the example of the tower building, the office building. It was bought for $600,000 or $700,000. That's a baseline value. They're going to spend $2 million in there renovating that building. So hopefully when they're done, the building will be valued at $3 million. The property taxes will still be given to the taxing entities at the $700,000. The extra tax that they pay for the improvements will come back to the bucket. And then the bucket will give the incentives to the tower. If they do $2 million, we may say, we'll reimburse you $1 million, say 50% of the improvement costs. You'll get back in a rebate from the ad valorem taxes. But the bucket is where the money comes from, and the bucket gets filled from all the changes in ad valorem and sales taxes if we use that. And every project is different. The AT&T building will be different than the tower building, and that will be different than if we do something with the DeVille Shopping Center. But most of the properties on 23rd Street are not big properties. There's not a lot of land other than some raw land, but that even could be developed. But we're also looking at some big apartment complexes that are in terrible shape. So the question, will the council want us to direct to try to acquire those and take them out and rebuild and renovate? This tool gives us the flexibility for that. The other thing it does is the public improvements. Most of the infrastructure along 23rd Street was put in the 60s and 70s. It's in the 60-year useful, we're extending the useful, so we need to look at ways that we can upgrade some of that infrastructure, including the streets, including the curbing, including the sidewalks, and the streetlights. Those are all things. But the $8 million will go a long way along that corridor for public infrastructure. Now, if we didn't do that, if we didn't use the TIF money as a backfill to the bucket, we would be taking out of general fund operations. And the council knows that the general fund operations, there's not a lot of surplus to take on an $8 million debt for just one part of town. So,
one thing I might add to pick up on that, so there are these different means of providing it, but to your point, the money isn't there on day one. On most projects, it's very, very difficult to borrow against the TIF until you have like a proven revenue stream. So most often, I think we'll see agreements work as a sort of a rebate type arrangement. Like say, for example, the folks invest in the tower building, you enter into a development agreement with them, basically saying, if you will come renovate this building and you're committing that you're going to invest $2 million and we anticipate this value upon completion, we agree that we will pay you assistance in development financing in an amount, say, of 50% of your property taxes above what the base was for the next 10 years. So you make that contractual promise, but then you have to wait till they pay their taxes, it goes over to the county, comes over to the city, and then you can make an annual payment to the developer. Follow-up question?
Have you, because you did talk about maybe including sales tax, I'm assuming the money in the TIF fund can only be used for projects in the project area.
Exactly.
And so I'm assuming that if you do go ahead and include the sales tax as TIF district as well to fund that TIF bucket of money, sales tax collected in that project area goes to that, correct? The 3.8%, the one that usually goes into the general revenue fund, will go into the TIF thing. Have you had analysis of how hard that would affect Bethany's general revenue fund over time, over the period of 20 years?
That is a great question, and
Before anybody else asks a question, do we have another mic that we can pass around? So that we all can hear the questions that are being asked?
we could pass this one, and then I could sit over
appreciate
there.
it.
What, do you want to explain how the sales tax formula actually does work?
Thank you.
Well, right, because it's only going to be the new projects.
Yeah, with the 23rd Street TIF and TIF C for the 39th Street project plan,
I'm having trouble hearing you.
with the 23rd Street TIF and TIF C in the 39th Street project plan, those being more prospective, interspersed properties that could be redeveloped. The sales tax increment is defined in the project plan only as you mentioned the general fund sales tax, but it's only those sales taxes that are generated from projects that enter into a development agreement with BDA, the Bethany Development Authority, that involve some kind of sales tax provision in its reimbursement or in its assistance. So unless a project is going to actually include that as part of the assistance given, it will not be considered increment, and it will just go into the general fund coffers in the city.
So it should be no impact on the general fund, and that's really important here. And it's also 90% just of the new ones. So on a piece of ground that's generating zero sales tax today, if a new project comes in and generates sales tax, and it needs assistance to happen, we are at most going to capture 90% of its sales tax. The other, and with the CIP is also not going in.
Yeah, it's
right.
0.70.
So, I'm sorry, so the .70 CIP is untouched, and then it's only 90% of the undedicated portion that would go into the TIF. And mind you, not all of the TIF goes back to developers. As Hank was pointing out, some of it will be used for infrastructure needs in that area. So let me be perfectly clear. The goal is to hold the general fund absolutely harmless and hopefully generate enough new economic activity that it would actually be helped.
Can you explain the CIP concept to make sure we're clear on that?
The CIP is just a dedicated 0.7% sales tax. It's set aside in a specific dedicated fund to be used for capital improvement projects.
That was done by ordinance for the city. That's on all sales taxes that the city receives from the tax commission. Is that 0.70 is dedicated to CIP. When you take 90% of the remaining 3.3%, there's 4% altogether. 0.70 goes to CIP. That's city-controlled, city infrastructure. The balance is 3.30. 90% of that makes it 0.30 plus the 70 gives us 1%. So effectively, we're getting 25% sales tax to the city that we would not otherwise get from something that does not exist, and we're giving up 75% of the city's portion of the sales tax. So the hope is that we would increase the sales tax total dollars by incrementally adding a little bit more that's not there on a vacant piece of land. There's no sales tax revenue. There's no harm. We haven't harmed the city as far as adding to the capital improvement funds through the CIP. That's a dedicated deal. And the 0.3, the 10% of the 3.3 that's remaining, together that's a 1%. That makes it a 75%, 25% split. And I think that that's a very doable and very, respectable and honest approach to doing these incentives. We get a little bit, we give up some, but we're getting nothing now, so we're not at risk. The other thing is that the CIP helps the underlining capital improvement projects for the whole city. That CIP money is not dedicated to just 23rd Street, but can come into the general fund through the dedicated account and be used to pave other streets and do other sizable projects and funding. So it does contribute to the overall general fund of the city, but it's through a dedicated account.
And
I have a question for Leslie. I'm trying to understand the 90% and the maximum 25 years. It seems to me that that's a awfully large hunk of the sales tax revenue for an awfully long period of time. How do we justify 90%? I can't wrap my head around that, how we would tie that much of our future revenue up for that length of time.
So it's only 90% of new projects that are under a development agreement. All the rest of your sales tax will work exactly the way it does. And in fact, there'll be, it's this 10% of that plus the 0.7 CIP will still go where it would otherwise go. So you should see, growth as we make these projects happen. Again, not tapping the general fund in any way. And I also think that a major portion of this is really going to come from the ad valorem side. So it's that growth, the long-term, slow, consistent growth in the property tax revenues, which will be, I think, the bulk of the revenue that's generated by both projects.
Well, I guess what bothers me is over the 24 years that I've watched very carefully the finances and the economy in Bethany, our cost of doing business, our cost of running the fire department, the police department, everything else has gone up much more rapidly than our revenues have come in. It has created a bind a number of times, and a lot of that is unfunded mandates. So my concern is that your sales tax is one of your strong drivers, that and utilities, on the revenue that's used to fund these services. And is the 90% really necessary?
So could you put the basic TIF image up there again? So on the sales tax side, just like on the ad valorem side, your base should stay exactly the same at worst. But in addition, every time we make a new project happen, you're going to start getting that little upward trend above the base. And this is just in the 2 increment districts, right? It doesn't cover the whole city. I mean, these are significant portions of it. I don't want to underplay that. But especially on 39th Street, the vast majority of it is completely undeveloped property today. So what we're talking about is, can we make growth happen on those undeveloped parcels? And what we're saying is, we're going to put some sales tax, not all of your sales tax, some sales tax in, and all the new property tax in to help make it happen. So as we run the numbers on what we anticipate to happen there, the bulk of what will be generated in TIF is definitely on the property tax side. Now, the concern you outlined is a very real one, and one of the first things we identified when we started, having any contact with Bethany at all is exactly the same problem that we've seen in similar small cities around the state, and that is that you're still paying for the bulk of your capital improvements with sales tax. Well, you do have another source you can use to pay for those capital improvements, and you can pass a general obligation bond and tax property. Your operations can only be paid from sales tax under the wisdom of the Oklahoma Constitution. But there's basically money sitting on the table that's not yet being accessed by cities like Bethany because they haven't done a general obligation bond to meet their basic infrastructure needs. You've had good success with the new library, so that's promising. But, we've recommended to a couple other municipalities that are now very happy with just a modest-sized GO bond that basically, just has a minimal effect on property taxes, but spread over your entire jurisdiction over a number of years, gives you a real boost to pay for that public infrastructure that is, 50 and 60 years old. I mean, it is a very real problem in cities. And so, I've told both the mayor and the interim city manager, if you do nothing else with us and we say goodbye, thanks, it's been nice to meet you, we think you ought to, this is not us who does this, we think talking to someone about getting a general obligation bond going so that you can make sure that those infrastructure things are taken care of and still meet your operating needs for public safety. It makes good financial sense. I think you'd be well served.
Yes. I think a number of us understand that Bethany has let the GO bonds drop off as a continuing source of keeping the city up to date. If I may ask one other question, in your previous presentations, you've talked about the special arrangement that was made in one of the districts up on 39th to take care of the Putnam School. If you'll go to 23rd Street, let me ask a question about that. The tallest piece of property there is 23 acres of residential property. The McFarland property is a total of 50 acres, and I think there were roughly 30 acres there that were residential. Why did we not do a similar type of discipline or protocol on 23rd Street?
We weren't 100% certain that there was going to be any residential included here. We were on TIF A in 39th Street. That's the only reason, pretty much.
If we ended up with a major residential component there, I think, and if it was a development that needed assistance, then I think we would want to talk to the developer about a pilot, a payment in lieu of an additional payment so that we could, or the city would negotiate a change so that we could make sure that we're not harming the school district there.
Okay, so there is an ability to open the door again on the negotiations so that the school district would not be happened if that development did occur.
Right. We want to keep the schools well taken care of and happy with us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Along with the sales tax, in particularly TIF 39th Street, District A, not only going back to, you made the comment in an early on meeting, don't have a race to the bottom. And it does seem like we're giving up a lot of revenue, particularly on the sales tax side, which is a great deal of concern to me. Keeping the city operating going forth. And the problem is so many, we have a number of properties, a lot of acres on 39th Street, and then even more on 23rd. And I don't think our city is so desperate that we can give that we'll sit back and say, nothing is going to come along in the next 10 years. I think things are turning around in Bethany. Things are doing well. But yet we've laid all of our cards out on the table right up front, offering 90% sales tax reimbursement.
Well, let me remember one clarification. Could you put one of the budgets up there again? Again, this money is earmarked or dedicated. It's going in the TIF bucket, but it's the city's money. There's no developer who has any automatic right to a single penny of it unless or until the city, working through BDA, negotiates a contract under which any of that money or any other public expenditure is made on their behalf. So on TIF A, that one is rather exceptional because to get that project to happen, with that developer is going to take a lot of assistance. So those funds are committed there. On the rest, though, I really do think that you'll begin to fund some of these public improvements that you would have otherwise hoped to pay out of your general fund or the regular CIP. There's discussion of other improvements in keeping with, on 39th, the Route 66 vision, whether it's gateway signage or landscape, streetscape, those things. It's not automatically going back in the pockets of the developers. And then on 23rd in particular, really a desire to help step up the streetscape and the city's infrastructure. So it's still your money. And, unless or until a developer comes to the table and has something that they want to make happen, that you want to see happen, you're not obligated to pay any of it to them.
I realize we're not obligated, but we've told them it's available up to that, and we're giving it to the first developer. So we're setting the bar very high to where everybody coming in next, I think they're going to expect it.
Well,
And possibly when they don't get it, they'll get upset and go down to the Route 66 landing or something.
Well, one of the implementation steps that we need to do right away is put in place a set of policies that frankly are a lot more user-friendly than the project plan itself, which has all these legal requirements it has to meet. And it's in those policies that I think we will establish the city's expectations about what sort of, rebate or other assistance it's willing to provide for what sort of project, whether you're identifying, the type of use, the type of development. Is it a restaurant, a retail store, is it a grocery store? What is it you're looking to have happen, and what's the basic framework of the assistance you're prepared to offer? Let me tell you, I sure hope none others get the level of assistance that it would take to do the project in TIF A. That's just extraordinary.
So if we don't expect that, why don't we change that in B and C now? Why do we still have language to where they can still get up to the 90% sales tax?
It's capturing it, but not giving it back to them. I mean, it really comes down to whether you want to try to fund some of these other public infrastructure things as well. One reason to keep some of the sales tax in there is that it's kind of keeping good faith with the property taxing jurisdictions, that we kind of all have some skin in the game. So to the extent that you're able to generate projects that are going to be good sales tax generators for the city, it makes sense to invest some to get some back.
But you said some, 90% is a whole lot more than some. And then my concern is, especially on District A, is I think if you look at life cycle of businesses, why the business is in its prime is where they're going to be getting the large rebate.
Well,
and then when it's declining is when we'll start getting it back.
Well, we can negotiate the terms of that. It doesn't have to be over any set period of years. And it might be more useful to use Hank's figures. We're really talking about 75% of the overall sales tax being captured. That figures makes a little more sense because we're not capturing any of the CIP anywhere, and then it's just the 90%. And in most of them, should turn this over to you, it's only the developments that are under an assistance contract, right? So many the things that happen on their own without any assistance from us we're not going to give them any sales tax.
But once they know it's, so like I was curious, the Sears building, the new building, it's in TIF District C. So I'm not sure why that building would be in there. But so we have a new store coming in, the new anchor store in the corner. They came in on their own, but now if you sit back and you look and you say, hey, this is in part of the TIF district and sales tax is available in incentives and grants, don't you think when they read this and they know it's available, they wouldn't come to us and ask for it then?
John, Counselor, what you're missing is that it's not just to fill storefronts. First of all, the shopping center recently changed hands completely, the ownership did. So if the owner came to us and said, we want to spend $3 million and build a 2-story mall and bring in more square footage, we would have to look at that. But we're not going to go down to the micro, trying to micromanage a shopping center. That TIF was put into that corner because of the crematorium lot right behind it. And so part of the projects will go on an individual negotiating basis. But when you look at the $18 million for infrastructure, that would come from general funds. So if you had $500,000 that we're going to get a water well out of the TIF, that $500,000 cost is equivalent to what? $1.5 million in sales taxes that we're projecting that we might get, but we, the city, are going to get a water well out of the project. The infrastructure of $18.5 million, the sales tax is added to the ad valorem to get to an amount that will subsidize and pay for this improvement. It's not like it's not coming to the city directly or indirectly. The 75% that is going to the TIF, think about that 75% helping pay for the $18.5 million worth of infrastructure. If you want to lower that in half, we can lower the sales tax to only being 50%. But see how it has an effect of being able to have the bigger bucket to do bigger projects on the behalf of the city for the infrastructure side. We're getting the benefits as part of the package. The position of 90% versus 50% or 60% is getting lost in the big picture of infrastructure that we would be getting out of the TIF districts that we do not have to pay out of a GO bond or a revenue bond or out of general obligation. Out of the budget on an annual basis. That frees up the city, I would think, to be able to do more things with the monies that we do have coming in versus nothing that's coming in now. We can't do anything of a water well with no TIF project in place. We don't have the resources to go out and drill a $500,000 infrastructure for a water well. These are the things that I think the public would like to see us take the advance and put this out there. We're gambling that the sales tax in some regards over the time is going to make 20% of the total TIF money. It may not. The ad valorem may have to carry it. But we have a restriction of 25 years. But when we put the numbers together, we're extrapolating what we think the sales taxes will do and what the ad valorem will do. But it does not dismiss the ability for the properties adjacent to it or other businesses that come in that aren't here, aren't even looking at here, to all of a sudden see the energy created by a TIF district and other businesses come in. The city benefits from the ripple effect of the sales tax dollars and from the property appreciation around the TIF. That's why the taxing agencies freely give up the TIF, knowing that they're going to rise with all of the economy in Bethany because it's good economic policy to do these types of projects. It's been successful all over the state.
My concern would be that the ripple effect will be minimal because all of our prime properties are within the TIF districts.
All the prime ones to redevelop.
To redevelop.
Well, the
or
ones
reuse.
the ones that can happen on their own, we won't be providing any assistance to them. But you've definitely hit on, the key insight about developers, and that's that they will ask for the moon. And so I really do think, immediately upon, if the TIF is approved, that adopting a set of policy statements, and that's really what, sort of an applicant for TIF funds, a prospective developer would be looking at. And it would spell out the criteria, like, it may be that you want to limit it not only to certain types of projects, but you could have certain design requirements. It can be done so that they have to prove up a level of need. That's pretty labor intensive to do that analysis on every project. So what we've tentatively recommended is to put a set of policies in place that would split the TIF sales tax revenue with some of these small businesses that might go in at 23rd Street to bring some dark spaces back to life. If a mom and pop opens a new restaurant there in what's currently just a dark space, frankly, they don't generate a whole lot of revenue, but they do generate, life and character and community. And so by splitting like that increase in sales tax, say maybe 50-50 with them for a few years, that makes the difference between whether they can, open a restaurant and hire one employee or not. We're not really talking about a lot of money. It's really only the kind of mega developments that propose to invest tens of millions of dollars where it's going to take an awful lot of incentive to make them happen. And it's absolutely none of those agreements have been, presented. It may well be that the city approves the TIF and that you don't want to assist developments of that type. Those are still open questions, like what level of assistance and on what terms.
Just a slightly changed subject. On the public improvement infrastructure, the $18.5 million for the 39th Street, is that just for the city's use of infrastructure, or will that also be for the developer, particularly on District A? Does that include his infrastructure that he's putting in?
No, money going to the developer, even if it's paying for infrastructure costs, would be lumped into the assistance and development financing.
I'm excited to see this happening, but I have some concerns. And some of us that have been around for a little while, we have seen dreams be presented to us and they not come to pass. As far as the city expenses have been concerned, how can we guard against a situation that we had? Let me back up. We know that the infrastructure on 23rd needs to be drastically improved. It's old, it needs to be fixed. We had some infrastructure put out on 39th Street west of Council. It's out there. It's never got used. We thought it was going to a few years ago and it still isn't. So the city without that money to put that infrastructure out there, how can we guard against that happening? And then my second question is, in light of how we want all of this to come as you are presenting it, that's a dream we all have. What is the very worst thing that could happen if we move forward with this TIF?
Okay, so in answer to your first question, providing infrastructure and then hoping that private development will come along is, a common strategy. And we see a lot of examples of when it works but takes a long time, so just to point to a couple of examples and contrast this with how I recommend it be done. If you look at something even like the Bricktown Canal in downtown Oklahoma City, that was a tremendous expense by the city. And if you'll notice, there's still undeveloped parcels on some pieces of that canal. On the other hand, there are a lot of restaurants that have opened, a lot of warehouses that have been renovated. So it's sort of a mixed results situation. You see other places where, say, like the Plaza District, again in Oklahoma City, where they put that first streetscape in, if some of you may remember like me, I mean, it's about 20 years now. And it sat around with maybe the dance studio was there and finally Lyric on the Plaza came along. But now it's the hot place. Everybody loves the Plaza District. But, it was like 10 years of next to nothing. So the build it and they will come philosophy, it's, the safe part of it is cities build public infrastructure all the time. We build nice wide streets and no one cries too much if the traffic counts aren't as high. But when we build it in the hopes of development, you do feel like your dreams have been disappointed if it doesn't come to pass. So putting it in if and only if there's a corresponding development under an agreement is how you ensure it happens. Like, you know what, we're not doing this pretty streetscape with the brickwork and the historic lightings until we have at least, 3 property owners who are committing to make something happen here. So you sometimes that first strategy is okay, but it's those contracts where it's, I promise this if you will do that. I've talked so long on that, I can't even remember your second question.
You answered it.
Okay.
I think the difference is.
Oh, the worst case. Thank you.
I think the difference is that property changed hands a couple times since the public and sewer and water was brought out to that parcel, is what you're referring to at Waterside. Isn't that what you're concerned? The infrastructure that was brought out to Waterside and never developed.
Well, I'm not talking about to Waterside. I'm talking about, that was 2 developers ago, if I remember correctly.
That's what, yeah.
So the dream was there. The people were there. It was happening, and we had all the promises, but we didn't have it right. I don't think. I wasn't on the council at that time. But we had In fact, well, I was, because it was the first presentation at my council. I mean, it's a great presentation, much money, but the backers pulled out. And we had already got the infrastructure in there. So the city without that amount of money, I can foresee that being something that might need to be done on 23rd in order to get it moving. Not so much on 39th. I can see how we can get 39th to pay its way. But on 23rd, I have a little concern about how we're going to make too much happen over there. Because I've been working on the streetscape for many years, and now it's beginning to finally come to fruit. But it takes more than the money that's been appropriated for it. So then my question is, okay, we're going to have that money somewhere before the money's coming in for the TIF that we're offering. And so that over there, it's got to happen. We've got to do something over there because that's where the most of our sales tax is coming from. But I just want to be sure that we're setting our goals, especially on 23rd, where they're true, where cost of living ups and downs and all those kinds of things that we predict are as close as we can get there. That if it's going to cost, I can't remember the figure that we had for the streetscape. I'm thinking it was around $20,000-$30,000 for all that we were wanting to do on roads, and 30,000. Did I say that right? 30 lights and roads and intersections and things that need to be done. And that was just a few miles. And yeah, it's really expensive. So when I see something up here that's less than that, I'm thinking, this isn't gelling for me. But I don't have the whole picture, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, it's streetscape and infrastructure is so expensive, and that's partly why I'm advising the TIF can't carry the entire weight of that. The TIF is really designed as a tool to help bring about the private development. So my recommendation is, in general, when TIF is used for public infrastructure, you want to tie that still with a development agreement to the corresponding private investment. Not 100%. There are times it's justified without, but most of the time. So what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is nothing changes and you sit here with an empty bucket.
In regards to the 39th Street, I know people have said that they believe that will take care of itself and developers will eventually show up and it will happen. As far as TIF A, I truly 100% do not believe that will happen without the TIF. Just the cost of the land requires the TIF to be able to purchase because the asking price is so high. And so no developer is going to touch that. And that's been out of reach for the city forever. And so this is an opportunity to see that happen. As far as 23rd Street, we've talked about the streetscape and the revitalization and the black street lights and all of that stuff. And within the TIFs, these kind of things can happen. And we've taken the first step to make that happen by asking OG&E to re-engineer the lighting. You can't redo the lighting without first knowing what it's going to cost in re-engineering the lighting, because it has to be completely re-engineered, and all of that stuff can come through the TIFs. Some people don't believe that what we've done here with the Bachelor Group in predetermining where these TIFs could be. Some people say, well, we shouldn't have done that. You wait for a developer and they'll show up and then you do a TIF. That hasn't worked for the city of Bethany ever, and developers have run away from Bethany for whatever reason over the course of a few decades. And us doing these kind of things, being forward-thinking enough to try to set our city up for success rather than fearfully making decisions, fearing what's the worst-case scenario. The worst-case scenario is it continues to be like it has been for the last 30 years. I met with 2 developers today and took a tour because they wanted to see these properties on 39th and 23rd because they heard of this, that we're doing this. They would not have come here or called me for a meeting to see this unless we were forward thinking. So I know we don't all agree about the percentages or whatever, but at least we're forward thinking and we're having this conversation because we have to do something, because if we continue to do what we've always done, this is what we've got.
So it seems obvious that it's an incentive, and we want people to come here that has not come in the past, or if they have left. And I just want to address, in your experience, can you give us any idea, once a TIF is in place, when developers come, what kind of fallout might happen? Do people pull out of that? What does that do to the city or the TIF if there's the same kinds of dreams that aren't realized? Once this is in place, does that happen very often, that developers come and that they don't fulfill what they need to, and that it has any kind of impact on the city? Could you just speak to that at all?
Sure. You see a whole gamut of types of projects in TIF districts. Some of them need large amounts of money and are like very, very difficult projects to make happen. Where you really are looking to the private developer to be able to put together a proposal for a project that generates enough revenue that they can borrow enough and get enough investors to make the project take. So yeah, sometimes there are projects where you've offered up under a contract an amount of TIF assistance, and that developer, for whatever reason, cannot pull off that project. I mean, we've had some near misses. I mean, people who are around me very long probably get tired of me talking about the Skirvin Hotel, but it's like you don't stop talking about your first child. The Skirvin Hotel deal almost fell apart when the developer's financing fell apart. And we had to rearrange what we were doing on the city side to restructure our loans and our lease and things so that they could get a new equity partner, have the deal make sense. And we structure that in a way that there's a payback to the city of Oklahoma City, and the hotel is on a ground lease, and it pays rent based on its profitability. So you have to get creative. You have to work with the developer on these big projects to make them happen, and sometimes they don't come to pass. You see plenty of empty parcels around the metro where things have not yet happened. But it is back to this thing. So what's the worst that can happen? The worst is that we're not better off than we are today. So, but you haven't committed. You've offered, but it's an offer that can only be accepted. It's sort of all the ones we do are structured as a pay for performance. We are not. I mean, we're not asking the city, take money from your general fund, front the costs for this developer, and then hope he does what he has signed a contract to do. But, we will say, if you build this, you will get these revenues that your project generates. Now it's up to you to make it happen. There's only so much the city can do. We cannot do the developers' jobs for them, much as they sometimes want us to.
I think it's important that we clarify to the layperson, we're not entering into an irrevocable contract with the devil. We still have total control over this TIF.
Yeah.
And I think the conversation is kind of, we're locked into this deal. We're going to end up getting the short end of the stick, and I just don't see it that way. Our bucket is empty right now. And not only is it empty, it's got holes in it. And, we've got nothing to work with. This gives us an opportunity to bring in those developers. And yes, we're going to have to pay for it. It's going to have to be incentivized. But I think in the long term, we're going to see through the infrastructure, through the residual effects of bringing business in on the peripheral, and I guess we don't know what that might be long term. We're looking out 10, 15, 20, 25 years. But I've been around this city long enough to know that the bucket's been empty, and we've had property setting for over 30 years that needs to be developed. I don't know what all the answers are, but
statehood. Some of it since statehood.
Well, you're right.
Well, I really appreciate that comment. I think, by way of follow-up, how are we going to fill up this bucket? And how are we going to make sure that those of you elected to govern the city keep enough control of it that you're happy with the outcome? So keep in mind, there are no contracts with the devil or otherwise at this point. So I really appreciate that.
All I'm saying is, how do you make a bucket lighter?
So,
The only way you can make it lighter.
So, So I think it might be useful to keep in mind, even though there's a wide variety of projects, let's think about sort of two types that are going to, that you'll see in broad terms. One, we want to make a lot of these smaller projects happen, the ones that bring life and color to the community, that help a local person who maybe today has a food truck but would like to have a restaurant, or a flower shop owner who has a torn up awning that would like it to look better and would get more business if she could. And, they just need, a few hundred or a couple hundred, couple $1,000s over time to help make those small things happen. So if we have these little projects that have these policies with sort of a cookie cutter arrangement that if you do A, B, and C, you'll get this small rebate to incentivize these activities. And then you have the home run projects that we'd like to work on. Those take individual consideration and analysis, and those need to come back with a full presentation to council acting as BDA for who's this developer, what's he proposing to do, how much value is he going to bring, how much assistance are we going to give, what are the terms of that assistance, and are we okay with that? And only when you give your blessing to a particular agreement like that, does a penny of the TIF flow. Otherwise, it's just filling up your bucket to be spent in these broad ways, assistance for development or public improvements, unless or until you decide how to spend it.
Well, and
As long as you'll put up with me.
Leslie, if I may, each individual agreement with a developer is specifically negotiated by the city related to what the city wants and their needs or infrastructure requirements, as well as what the developer needs in order to put placement of the commercial residential areas. So to say that we're going to apply 90% across the board to everything is not a fair statement, because if you have one individual project, that'll be determined by the committee and then approved by the city through the process of the TIF. Over a period of time, I am 47 years old. I would like to see development in the city of Bethany before I go on to heaven. And the problem is that that has not happened, and this is an effective tool that has been created by statute by and through your firm through the state of Oklahoma, and it has provided a efficient shot in the arm for municipalities to begin development to raise their sales tax. And the last time I checked, we're not operating in the black, we're operating in the red, just because our sales tax revenue does not pay the bills. So if we're going to improve, we have to look at all available tools to get to that point, and we have to do our cost-benefit analysis before we make a determination. And that's what we're doing now. That's why we're proposing this, and that's why you're here. I mean, we've paid your firm a lot of money to get to this point because we want to be successful to increase the sales tax revenue in the city of Bethany, and this is how we have to do it. There are, other than a GO bond, the last time I checked, with the exception of the library, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure GO bonds that the community would pass to fix our roads and sewers and stormwater drainage. So this is another tool that we have in our arsenal to try to increase the quality of life in our sales tax base. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
Leslie, I appreciate your.
I'm going to heaven. He just told me.
I appreciate the fact that you've been at this for a long time in this business, and for the stragglers, we'll call them that can't catch the vision, I'd like for you to just list off 6, 8, or 10 projects that have been a direct result of TIFs.
Okay, well, of course, I start and end everything with the Skirvin. Most of the downtown Oklahoma City housing received some TIF assistance, so,
Devon Tower.
Well, it actually didn't get any assistance, but so sometimes TIFs can be used creatively, to capture revenue, Hank wants me to mention Devon Tower, which we set up a TIF and captured all its revenue and gave none of it, not a penny, to Devon, and we used it to do the Project 180 streetscape downtown, plus put some money into Myriad Gardens. So you can fund public things with it, but Devon didn't want to be in a wasteland. They wanted to have a setting that was worthy of a world headquarters. But we're kind of partial to a lot of the smaller communities that we've worked in too. We've now been working with the City of the Village for 10 years, and there we acquired a blighted apartment complex. The city itself, acting through its development authority, bought that, they tore it down, remediated the property, and put it out for proposals, and now they have really a lovely single-family neighborhood called Hawthorne there with a green belt in the middle. But I mean, that was years of work, but it was the TIF that was the only way we had to generate the financing on it. You want to talk about some of the ones you've worked on recently?
Some interesting ones. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with Carlton Landing.
Can't hear you.
Carlton Landing is Oklahoma's newest incorporated municipality. It's out near Lake. It's right on Lake Eufaula, actually, about probably 10 minutes south of the town of Eufaula. But they, brand new town, incorporated probably 8 or 9 years ago. They've been growing relatively quickly, but not quickly enough to suit their needs. So they oriented a TIF so they can essentially build out their town infrastructure using TIF. This is something that's probably accelerating their growth cycle by about 20, 30 years.
So then we have some projects like one in Owasso where they had never really had a downtown there because it's a suburb really of Tulsa. They wanted a downtown, and they had gone through a good planning process, and now they have the TIF, and most importantly the TIF policies with like an application, and developers fill out like what they're going to do, and then depending on what category they fall in under the policies, Owasso can help them. And now they've got like a nice mixed use project with this restaurant Smoke like they have in Tulsa, and they've brought about, they are going to have a little sense of a main street there, which they've never had before. So you can create, what you want if you roll up your sleeves and make it happen one project at a time.
And sometimes TIFs aren't used for strictly community development related projects. They're used for pure job focus. We've done several projects in Durant and Ardmore and Lawton where there's been pretty much strictly job generators, where TIF is used to fund necessary infrastructure or provide an incentive for somebody who's bringing in, thousands or more high-paying jobs. And that's the city was less concerned about what the project looks like and how it might activate the street, and more concerned about we can employ our residents. So,
Bass Pro would be a good example of bringing 11.
I also have two examples from Stillwater. We did, when I was on the city council, we did a TIF district for Lake Point Mall, which is an outdoor strip center just north of Lowe's. And as a result of that, we had an Olive Garden come in, a Panda Express. But then we had a 600-unit apartment complex go across the street and totally renovate themselves because of the traffic and the exposure that was going there. Then there was a second TIF, catty corner across the street that brought in a Walmart neighborhood store and an Academy Sports. Those are all directly resulting from the TIF being created with Lake Point. And that was just a shining example. But again, it took 15 years for that to materialize completely.
every financial analysis for any TIF project we've ever done has showed ancillary benefits that you can't really forecast outside the TIF district, things that would, the TIF district serves as a catalyst for other development outside the town, and just generally is good, has all these indirect economic and other benefits to a city.
I received 2 emails today. One from Mr. Bowles from the Putnam City School that represented the TIF committee, approval committee, or whatever they call it. And he says, as with school district bond projects, storm shelters, and athletic facilities, investments like a TIF provide stability and a positive outlook for the future of any community. Future generations are counting on our innovative vision and sacrifices made for them. And then Mr. Coleman, who is the general counsel for the Oklahoma City County Health Department, who also served on the TIF committee, said that he has served on many TIF committees over the years. I'm convinced that TIF is a significant economic tool when properly used. I have seen the positive impact TIF has produced for Midwest City and Oklahoma City. I encourage Bethany to fully embrace the TIF concept and utilize it to move its community forward. In 2017, November 9th of 2017, in the very same room that those people met, they also met when Councilmember Herron was chairing the first TIF, the Waterside TIF, that did not come together. So I know we've been in this process before, and I understand Mrs. Larson she was on the council when they voted to appoint John as the chair for that TIF and involved in that property and seen all the disappointments, and I get that frustration. I just had a question because I know, John, you have issue with the 90%, which for that, TIF A, do you recall what the agreement was with Waterside? 0 on ad valorem was what? Because I don't recall.
It was as much as he could get out of 25 years. Full amount.
Potentially 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't it 20 million? I don't think it was that much.
So 100% on ad valorem, not taking into consideration the CIP and the PC schools and the education situation our state's in right now. I think that what we've done here is a total plus, allocating that 10% to the school district. What's going on out there as far as the TIF A? There's 0 sales tax being generated now, and there will be 0 sales tax generated if, in my opinion, if we don't do something in regards to this. And I understand people are hung up on certain percentages, but what it is what it will always be, because it's just not, a developer's not going to touch it without the TIF. And so I'm encouraged about what these people have to say, the sacrifices that previous council has made to be able to try to make these kind of things happen. And now we have a council, hopefully, and have hired the Bachelor Group to help us move forward down the road so that we can have developers interested in Bethany again to see what we can do. So all of that said, I'm just excited about it.
Yeah, I think that Bethany has been kind of a sleepy little town for so long. I think that we have to get some momentum, and I see that's what this is. You can almost compare it to physics. You have to get the momentum going before you can really get things moving. And I think if you get a development like this on the west side of town, it generates more traffic, it gets other business interested, and then people start putting things in that they're not necessarily asking for assistance on this, or it's much less than what we had to give the original developer, because we're not locked into 90% with anyone. So you have businesses say, hey, what's going on out here? I want to be there because there's more traffic and there's more things happening. So I think you have to get that first building block in place, something significant, in order to attract some more businesses. And then maybe we don't give anything away of sales tax on some of those, like Hank was talking about, all those businesses moved in. So I just think you have to do something extraordinary to start with in order to get the momentum moving your way.
It's kind of priming the pump, right? Once it gets going, you're all right.
I think the gentleman in the back had another question.
Perhaps you've already discussed this. I wasn't able to get here until late. But I would be interested to hear a description of the process by which the bucket gets filled with the funds for the TIF. Let's say council passes it, it goes into effect on such and so date. So at that point in time, after that, the sales tax that's been earmarked and the ad valorem tax that is earmarked starts going into an account, or what exactly is that process?
Well, we'll go over ad valorem first. So when a TIF district is created, the city assuming the city is the one adopting the TIF district, will send a notice to the county assessor saying that they've created an increment district. The county assessor, within 90 days, is required to certify the base assessed value of that TIF district, which is the ad valorem, the assessed value of all the property within that district as of that date. And that certification stays with the TIF throughout the rest of the time, and that's where you get this existing tax base on the illustration. So in subsequent years, for ad valorem purposes, the county assessor just continues to do their regular assessments. But when they give the regular assessments over to the county treasurer's office, the treasurer looks and sees, well, what was the base assessed value? So the ad valorem tax rate applied to that base assessed value is what is distributed to the taxing jurisdictions. And the ad valorem values above that base assessed value, the tax rate applied to it, is what is sent to the city and put in the apportionment fund to use for these project costs. And then once it's in the apportionment fund, which is a city fund, the city is free to use it according to whatever authorizations that they provide, development agreements, public infrastructure projects, etc. For sales tax, it's largely similar, and it's going to be a little bit different here because there's not going to be any sales tax increment unless a project comes in under a development agreement that includes sales tax. So this, in that regard, there's going to be zero sales tax base. They'll just provide in each development agreement the sales taxes from this project will be considered increment, and so as part of the development agreement, there will likely be some provision that requires that business to either provide a tax ID number or provide copies of its sales tax reports that it provides to the tax commission on a monthly basis, so the city can track how much sales tax is actually collected there.
It might be worth like following that through to think about it in particular examples. So on the ad valorem or property tax side, if you have, say, a vacant building like the AT&T building or the tower building, and they're on the tax rolls, just hypothetically for $200,000 today, then, you know, if nothing happens between now and next year, there's no increment really coming off that. But once the new investment is made, the taxes on that new investment are what's going in that bucket. So the first few years, I mean, just be warned, like the bucket's still pretty empty, you know, because when you think about the timing of redeveloping or investing in a property, it's not until it gets its certificate of occupancy that there'll be the new assessment, and then that takes effect January 1 of the following year. The tax bills don't even go out until October of that year. People pay the first half by December and the second half by the end of March. So you're talking basically 2 years between the new investment and seeing the ad valorem dollars, which is part of the reason why it's important to structure these agreements in a way to shift the burden of waiting, you know, to the developer. Yeah, we'll help you with assistance, Madam Developer, but it's going to be paid out of the increased taxes that you pay, and if we all have to wait on them, that's just the way it is. But done right, that contract is, you know, it's a firm and legally binding commitment to pay, and associated with this, you can paper it up nicely with a TIF note, a TIF promissory note, and if the developer has a big enough project and strong enough credit and can pull a project together, he can often borrow against that TIF note. That's what they're doing in Carlton Landing. You know, it's not a debt of the city. It is a debt of the developer, and he's telling his bank, I will pay back this debt with the TIF revenues when they come to me. But the notes that the city delivers are just a promise to pay whatever TIF is in the bucket. If the bucket's, you know, not filling up, the city doesn't have to go elsewhere to pay those promises.
I have a couple questions. Did the city of Bethany approach you for this TIF district project, or did you approach the city first?
They approached us.
Okay, and you said did your firm, did you work on the TIF districts in downtown Oklahoma City?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because the question I have is that recently the city of Oklahoma City approved to lend out about $40 million to the First National Bank project. They had some financing fall through And I actually had asked the council this morning about it. They're basically lending the money, acting as a guarantor to the First National Bank to help them get other stuff. And my question was, and that's what was my first question here, the reason why I asked is, will the city be on the hook for loaning this money out and just waiting for property taxes to pay into it? Will it be encumbered before you actually see the money in the bucket?
So just to clarify, although we helped Oklahoma City set up the original downtown TIF district, and we do a lot of work related to it, we are not working on the First National financing. The city of Oklahoma City now does so many TIF projects, and they have 2 pretty much full-time in-house city attorneys that do those agreements. So I can't speak to the particulars of that.
Well, it's similar like the Skirvin.
No, it's not, actually. That much I know.
Did your company do the Skirvin project, the sales tax?
We did.
And so the city, when they had financing fall through, they had to take money from the bucket to help it, correct, before it was gathered?
No, we did not.
Okay.
How to explain? There are about 8 different pieces that went into the Skirvin, and there was a loan of some federal money that did go in up front and was drawn down. So that's sort of exceptional. We don't do that very often. But the city did not back or otherwise borrow against the TIF itself. It put that part on the developer. But you're right, there were some loans into, probably, I don't know how much everyone wants to hear on this, but once you have a TIF, once your bucket is full, if you have a project that comes along that you really, really want to do, and you want to loan it money, you can say, look, I've got $1 million of TIF revenues sitting in my bucket, and we have one historic building left in the heart of our community, and we want to see that, restored instead of becoming a parking lot. So yeah, you can loan to a project, but that's only a viable option once you've generated that revenue, which realistically, is going to take many years and depends on what commitments you make with those funds up front. But even then, it's a loan of those TIF revenues. I would never advise a city client to make a pledge of general fund revenues for a project. We've seen really disastrous results of that in other states. And those are the stories that get sent around. People say, oh, you're doing a TIF? Well, looked at this thing they did in California or Chicago or Kansas City and how the city ended up on the hook. I'm like, yeah, they do sometimes. But they end up in worse shape than us for other things they choose to do. That's not how we do them here. And a public entity in Oklahoma cannot legally back a private loan.
It's not a private loan. The city is saying here, like with the First National Bank, they're giving them $20 million. Because the TIF wasn't created until 2016, and there's no way that there's $20 million of TIF money in that fund.
Well, so again, I don't know how much. I don't know the particulars of First National, but I have a lot of faith in the people working on it. And I know that they have sufficient revenues so that TIF is one of about 8 or 12 TIFs now in the downtown project area. So sort of like, we put one of ours up here, when you have several increment districts in one project area, you can use the revenues generated by one to help fund projects anywhere in that project area. So Oklahoma City has had such tremendous success with its downtown TIF that it has funds on hand and can borrow against the revenue stream that it has established going forward. So the city of Oklahoma City can borrow against its own TIF revenues. And that's like adding to the pot early, effectively, adding to the bucket. And it can loan those to a developer if it chooses to. And I don't know what particular security they have for that loan, but I assure you the city of Oklahoma City is very conservative with its funds, and so would not be going in if it did not assure they were going to happen.
Hold on.
The project was going to happen.
Because this is a council workshop, but it's open to the public. So anybody that's asked a question, before you leave, if you can give Ms. Lamar your name and address so we can keep track of who's here and who's asking what.
for the minutes.
And I just want to make a statement real quick. The Plaza District is not in a TIF district. It used to be like
That's
Crack
correct.
House Row, extreme, but the developers came together, formed a business alliance, and they bought businesses in. And so the city didn't have anything to do with that. They didn't have a TIF district. They haven't touched that street until recently, but, I was just wanting to point that out. Because
I didn't mean to suggest it's a TIF, but, these are all redevelopment and revitalization strategies, and one of the ways you can try to renovate or revitalize an area is by investing in public infrastructure, and that can be paid for a number of ways. You can get a federal grant when those still existed. You can use a TIF, but I think Plaza, actually, your point about the business association is key, because the public infrastructure basically sat there a long time. They put those lights in there. But you're right, it did absolutely nothing until the business and property owners came together and formed an association and made things happen. There's only so much the public side can do, whether it's putting the infrastructure in or entering into a development agreement. Again, we can't make the developers do their side of things. All we can do is try to create the conditions that make it a little easier, more desirable for the developers to do their part. We might tee that thing up a few places and wait around or eventually terminate an agreement if a developer doesn't perform. That happens.
I just want to clarify that when we talk about a TIF district that we're working on over here, and it's filled the pot, anything coming out of that TIF district pot has to be in that 23rd Street. We can't take from 23rd and move over to 39th, is
That's
that correct?
right.
And within the projects. You can't go within, on 39th, we have 3 separate TIF projects. Can they interchange on 39th, but they can't be moved over to 23rd?
Right.
Okay. I think as coming from a seated council person, and I've already said how excited I am about this to be happening, but my real concern is that we have the groundwork laid in those negotiations that they can do within the TIF. Like if we say the max is 93%, and we know we don't want to use that 93%, we want to averagely maybe keep it around, I'll pick a figure, 47 to 53, and say that 93 for the biggie or something else. Is there some way that we can solidify those guidelines that we set up for future generations so that we don't get a council in here that doesn't think prudently? I mean, call a spade a spade, that's all I know to do.
Well, as a council member, you probably know that you can't bind future councils, but you can formalize things, and I really do think that this set of policies should come back to council acting as BDA fairly quickly. You all have a lot of things on your agenda. We get that to happen, and that sort of sets the path for how these deals should be done. And that way, staff, those of us working for you on it, know, hey, if we show up with a deal for some little thing, but we're giving, all the increment to it, it might not get approved, or we'll need a darn good reason why this seemed like an important enough project that it was worth.
Accountability is more.
Yeah. And having clear, principled expectations about how public money is going to be spent is just best practices, right?
Leslie, on the TIF notes, that is accountability, isn't it? To the extent that you're requiring you will not approve the tax increment finance to the developer unless he meets certain requirements regarding his obligation to develop the land, and then and only then will he get a TIF note in order to proceed with his expenses and what he needs for the development. Is that right?
It depends. How's that for an unhelpful answer? I mean, he will only receive payment on those notes when he develops, but, how and when the city, again, city BDA, agrees in a given case when it will provide a TIF note to a developer is individually negotiated.
Right, and that's subjective to each individual agreement. So we could have numerous TIFs with multiple agreements that would be proposed and approved based upon the subjective need of that business or whoever wanted to come in as a developer.
On the big ones, you'll want to look at the particulars. On the little, I suspect you have a lot of small things you want to see happen, that if we can, get these policies and just say that below a certain level, this is almost automatic. If it's small enough, simple enough, a low enough value, yeah, go make it happen. Because there's a point at which, a $500 agreement will take more time and expense of staff and your time, and the developer will be left waiting. You want some easy off-the-shelf things that when the criteria are met, boom, go make your shop open.
And one of those criteria could be infrastructure related to the independent areas that are on 23rd and 39th. We're not just talking about the big project at the McFarland property. We could have infrastructure improvements through the TIF that the city would not have to pay that could be a part of TIF funds in those areas. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to emphasize that the TIF infrastructure on the McFarland property, there is nothing out there. You don't have drainage, you don't have sewer, you don't have anything. And so all of that will have to be taken at the risk of the developer in order to put all of that in. So the city's not paying for that, the TIF is paying for that, is that right?
Right.
And that would include a well, and from what we understand, an access to 50th Street, and a lot of signalization, and a lot of things that we don't have that the city would not have to pay for that we desperately need. I mean, seriously, we need a well. Last time I checked, with the North Well Field is closed, and we can't use that. And so we're not using that for drinking water. So this is a vital improvement that is required for the quality of life in the Bethany areas for the residents. I mean, there are a lot of collateral issues that are at play here, and I think it helps everyone, in my opinion, and hopefully we can get some consensus on that.
I think one of the things that about the percentage on the sales tax, I know that's a sensitivity, but the 90% for the both sides of that road is so critical because that's the western gateway to Bethany. We bring people off the turnpike, we bring people into town. The rest of it is easy, but right now we have got to put the maximum on the table that we can to get that side of town developed and get an entryway that people want to come to the community and spend money. Then the other infill, just like with 7-Eleven, we can negotiate differently. We didn't give a 7-Eleven ad valorem tax. We did it on a short-term 7-year sales tax agreement. So we can figure out what the needs are to make a deal happen and move forward. But like the 90%, that's a critical deal. It's like has been said that there's huge drainage issues. You're up against the conservation park on the west. You've got, there's a lot of restrictions there. But you also have historic Route 66, and we need to make a statement that Bethany is open for business and that we want that an attractive, commercial, viable corridor to begin at the city limits there.
On the infrastructure, and in particularly District A, when will the city receive that infrastructure money? Will we end up taking out bonds or promissory notes against that?
No. Do you want to explain that?
That's not anticipated right now. Again, we're still in negotiations with the developer, but as it stands right now, the developer would be fronting all of those costs in return for some TIF notes to help cover some of the costs.
And so the way that works, just to add to it, is basically, we enter into the development agreement with the developer. We specify what it is he's going to build and require that approval of the exact building plan get approved by BDA or someone at the city. Then he built, there's so many steps in this. During phases of the development, when he meets a milestone, we would provide him with a TIF note, which is basically just a promise to pay future TIF revenues, like in the amount of his infrastructure. So he has to go borrow against that or otherwise raise the funds to pay for the infrastructure. And all we've done on the public side is say that when those TIF revenues come in, we will pay you back for the infrastructure and the other incentives.
So that estimated $18 million infrastructure, that's infrastructure really just for that particular property?
Well, on that one, since we're paying it directly to him, that all goes in the budget item as assistance and development financing. So it's infrastructure, but when it's infrastructure paid for by the developer, it's a more precise label to put it in the assistance and development financing
So that
category.
just takes me back to my first question then. Your line item, $18.5 million for infrastructure, public improvement, that comes back to benefit the city, but when and how would we see that?
So when there's enough new development in those three TIF districts in the 39th Street plan, for example. So on A, it's looking like to make that project happen, we're going to be pledging pretty much everything it generates back to that developer for the bulk of the time of the TIF. But for other things that come online, either that don't ask for any assistance or that only need part of their assistance, when the TIF revenues come over from the county each year, say we have to pay out some of them to the various developers, but the overage, the surplus, is what we hold back for the city's infrastructure category in the budget.
So that could be years down the road.
It could be years down the road.
So revisiting the sales tax tip, that's just an option. Is that going to be is that guaranteed to be part of the 2 TIF districts? The sales tax TIF district?
So for 39th Street, all of them are sales tax districts. For TIF A and TIF B, there's a little bit of a different calculation for the sales tax increment. It's pretty much more of a geographic distinction. New sales taxes generated, or yes, should I say, new taxable sales generated in TIF A and TIF B would have the sales tax formula applied. But for TIF C in 39th Street and the TIF district for 23rd Street, it would just be based on what's included as increment in respective development agreements.
And so I guess my question is that, when we go and we visit businesses there and we pay the 3.87 city sales tax, we're not going to be seeing that sales tax go and disperse throughout the city for public services. It'd just be for projects in that area as a form of refund.
You'll be seeing 0.7% go to the city CIP fund, just like regular, and then
90% of the 3%.
90% of the 3.3% would go into the TIF fund, and the other 10% would go to the city's general fund.
And so, and that's just, because, from my understanding, that's how the city improves things throughout Bethany, is with general revenue, which would be coming from the sales tax. As it stands now, can the city adjust that if they don't feel comfortable saying, okay, 90% of that total sales tax, if they can ratchet it down to 25% or something like that, just so that the people of Bethany would know, okay, the sales tax I'm paying is actually going to be benefiting all of us, not just the people who, because I don't think there's any residential areas in the project zone, correct?
Not current. There is a residential component proposed for TIF A, which is why we have the revenue sharing with Putnam City School District.
Okay, is there any, can they specify, have the developer develop a couple of affordable housing units in that kind of agreement or anything like that?
Possibilities are there, but negotiations are fairly well along. So far that we anticipate bringing a development agreement to the council and BDA within the next month.
Is that something that's included in the development agreement?
It is not at the moment.
Could that be added before it's presented to the council?
It could, but with significant delays for the project.
Oh, okay.
Are there any other council members that have any questions before I shut this down? Since this is a council workshop. Has every council member gotten their, not the answer you wanted, but at least an answer to your question? Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So moved. Second.
All in favor say yippee. All right.
Well, thank you all. And feel free to reach out to us individually. We want to address any concerns that the council has.
If anybody needs a contact card, feel free to come grab mine.
Don't forget to leave your name and address, Mr. Lamar, right?